Have you ever found yourself saying something like, well, that strategy is great, but it's not going to help me grow my show. My show, it's not like that. My show is too unique. Well, you're not alone. Most podcasters think that the average podcast growth strategy is not going to work for them. But this podcast episode is going to help maybe sway you into being a little more receptive every time you're looking at a podcast strategy that you could implement, that could help you grow, and not be so defensive. So, I'm Anna Xavier. I've helped more than 100 podcasters grow their show, get more visible, get to their business goals, and achieve things they never thought possible, like getting their first sponsorship for $1,000. It may sound crazy in the beginning, but it's all possible when you apply the right mindset. Let's dive right into this week's episode of the Podcast Space. All right, this podcast episode is gonna trigger some people. I'm gonna try to be gentle because I know that a lot of people will be like, well, I believe that. Or people who will be just like in denial and saying, no, it's not gonna work. But here's the thing. I've worked with podcasters from all around the world, from Mexico to Australia to Sweden. I've helped people all around the world with very different needs grow their podcast. So when I say this, you have to believe that growing a podcast through frameworks is going to help you grow your show too. As unique as it is, think about it like this. We're all humans. We're all unique in our own way. However, we have a lot of commonalities with other humans, and that's when we focus on the things that are similar and not necessarily on like the exceptions. And so removing that idea that our show is too unique, too many moving parts to be able to grow as any other show would, that moment is really important to help you understand that growing your show is not as complicated as you think. And I want to make a side note here because I've met a lot of podcasters who were so afraid to grow their podcast. And I don't mean like to take the action, but is the fact that realizing that growing the podcast, it wasn't as difficult as they thought, was getting closer the idea they could actually be successful. And that scared them because when their podcast has under 100 downloads per episode, they're okay with it, right? But once the show starts growing, it starts becoming either very scary to put content out there because you start getting afraid of that wave of negative feedback that honestly like doesn't come as often as people think, but it's a real fear. I acknowledge it. It's all good. But at the same time, they think that while they're still small, they can make mistakes, or at least they're like more forgiving with their mistakes. And once the show starts growing, they start getting this responsibility. They start fearing what would happen if they don't have all the answers. What would happen if they forget something on the podcast that could lead someone to message them and say, hey, you forgot about this, or this other thing you didn't mention. And let me tell you that even though my podcast is small, I battle this every single episode, every single day. I see something that somebody posted and I look and I was like, oh my God, that would have been such a great point to make on the episode. And a lot of times I think, oh, should I add that to the episode? And then I hold myself back and say, no, that was enough. If I want to add on, I can always revisit that episode later on, but I don't need to take that episode down and go and fix it, right? One of those elements that I see that is like, again, more on the coaching side, that I recognize that people are afraid of their show growing because they think, well, everyone says that it's lonely at the top. And if I start becoming too popular, if my show starts growing seriously, am I going to have all of these people behind me trying to get stuff for free or try to get my influence or whatever it is, right? So they're actually afraid of growing the podcast because they're afraid of what could happen if the show starts actually getting serious traction. So that's something that I didn't realize in the beginning when I started working with creators and podcasters and business owners. They're okay with taking bold action in their business. But when it gets to taking bold action on the episodes, because it's so kind of public facing, they get really afraid of the outcomes. And then the second thing that I hear all the time is people saying, I tried being consistent. It didn't work for me. It didn't help me grow my podcast. And consistency is the number one thing that will help you grow your podcast. Think about it on the opposite side. If someone releases a podcast one time a month, and then it took them 2 months to put out a new episode, and then they released 3 episodes in that same following month, and then nothing for another year. It does not give that vibe of trust, right? But what it will do is build that connection and trust with your audience. Is like, oh yeah, like you're committed to me, the listener. What I think normally what doesn't happen is when people are trying to just be consistent, but they're actually not using a solid content strategy. So basically they are releasing episodes, but those are not necessarily connected to what the outcomes that they want, the goals that they want out of the podcast, or they're releasing content. But I see so many creators doing things like a day in the life, and I'm like, you have like 3 episodes that have nothing to do with what you do, or it doesn't really get you to your goals of like thought leadership. It's just like filler content. Why? Because they were too afraid to create, again, that next level of complexity. And so it's not that their podcast isn't growing, it's that they're, focusing on the wrong elements. And it can be scary to release consistent content. But again, if you're doing your business day in and day out, you're going to experience things that you can talk about. So it's making that commitment to releasing content that is aligned with your goals and that is aligned with what you want your podcast to do. Another thing that I see that people are saying, like, my show is too unique, that's why I'm not seeing any growth, is because they're looking at their audience engagement. And so basically they're saying like, oh, this is not enough, my audience isn't growing. But the reality is when you look at the engagement that the biggest accounts have online, the emails they receive, the newsletter replies, all of the other things that you measure success and growth by, they're not getting as much feedback as you think. And so when people think, oh, I want to grow the level of emails that I get, I want to grow and scale my podcast. But then what is happening already, and again, I talk about this all the time, if you have 5 people commenting on your podcast or on your social media or replying from an email, and you're not getting back to them, again, what does that say? It says that you don't get engagement back. So people are not going to be replying back. So it's not about the volume that you have, is making sure that the quality that you have is good and that you're taking care of them, because again, word of mouth is such a powerful element. And if you are someone who is asking for people to comment and share, audience engagement comes from telling people what to do, right? Like, people want to be told what their next step is. A confused user will not do anything else. If you're giving them either too many options or not options at all, like for instance, a clear example of this is people saying, I want to increase the engagement that I get on my audience. And I say, okay, what do you tell them? Like, oh, talk to me on social. I'm like, okay, which platform? And they go, well, any. Well, if they use all 5 and they're not sure which one you're actually using, they're not going to be engaging. But you say, for instance, I talk a lot on the podcast space. Talk to me on Instagram. Talk to me on Instagram. That's the platform I use. And so I do get people after they listen to the episode or after I post something like, I really like this episode. I'm like, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And so if you want more engagement out of people, we want to be nurturing that one-on-one engagement so that it can grow. And sometimes I get people saying like, oh, my industry or my niche, they don't engage a lot. If you were to look for other shows similar to yours, are they getting engagement? Sometimes it's just because, again, we don't think it's possible, so we kind of discard it. And so we say, oh, it's not worth my time investing in building that community with people because you haven't had historically engagement. And when you look at other shows, when you're like, oh, actually, like, people are engaging, so it's possible for you. And then I want you to really think about this. When you're looking at your episode, your podcast being too complex, too unique, is it because you're overcomplicating the episode itself? And so you're adding a lot of segments. And I see that all the time when people decide, oh, let's play a game in the middle of the conversation. And I had someone ask me that. I had someone stop the podcast, stop that flow, and then, oh, okay, this is the part where we talk about like rapid fire questions. And we were so deep in the conversation that actually it hurt the vibe. Like, I was vulnerable. I was sharing about growing a company and when you're multilingual, how hard it can be. And then suddenly, like, rapid fire, I'm like, okay, I guess we're doing this. And so how much of your show is being overcomplicated because you're trying to like replicate a lot of like different models. And so it's not resonating with the audience. So it's hard to grow a podcast that the content comes first, right? And so if the content is not resonating with people, you may have a hard time growing a product that is not landing with the audience. So look at that consumption rate. Look at how the episodes are performing on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube. Ask your audience, talk to them, ask them like, do you like this feature? What do you think about this feature? How would you like the podcast to be differently, right? Like you can take action to talk directly to the people who are listening to the show. So we're moving into the last element that is a little bit of what I just said. So sometimes because we make so few mistakes or what we're creating feels like it's not up to par to what we expect, right? Like maybe we look at the Diary of a CEO or, Call Her Daddy or just any podcast and that they have like maybe 17 people in their team and our show is still baby, taking a few baby steps. Or maybe it's just us doing it. And so we feel like the show is not worthy to be shared yet because we feel a little ashamed. And so we're not actually, again, what do I say? You have to share your content. Social media is not going to go explode your reach unless a clip by accident goes viral. But what will happen is that it will keep your audience, your current network engaged. And so when we say this clip is not enough for whatever reason, we are not showing them the product that we are part of. And what a great way to say 2 years ago, last year, I had this setup and it didn't really work well. Like for instance, the podcast space has changed a little bit. Like I had some renovation happen in my house. I'm moving to Arkansas. And so the space will look different. And that's actually why I pre-recorded all of the season number 2 in about 3 weeks. But when we're looking at creating growth, generic podcast advice says you have to promote your podcast in order for it to grow. And when we're looking at our network and we feel ashamed to share it, it's not going to grow. So we have to leverage the best takeaways of our episodes, the best pieces of content, and really talk to the people that already follow us, that they appreciate what we do. And yes, it's not always going to be amazing. I know some episodes don't look great. As long as the content is good, people are going to be engaging. So it's not because your show is too unique. It's because you're shying away from doing the basic things. So for instance, sharing your content, leveraging your existing network to grow. You're just focusing on the wrong metrics and not looking at the moving parts and disrupting the listener experience. Overcomplicating what listener engagement is. You're not looking at engagement and saying this is enough and what is the growth that I've experienced. No, you're just saying this is not enough. This is not enough. Or then last but not least, like you're really looking at your podcast having too many unique elements and you're just like basically discarding every growth strategy possible. So if this episode helped you understand a little bit that you've been kind of just denying your growth because you're just overcomplicating what growth could be because you're scared of what the growth could bring, I invite you to book a call with me. It's a free discovery call. Go to thepodcastspace.com/grow and you can learn about how we can work together to grow your podcast, which ways feel authentic, which ways feel aligned, what you don't want to do. It's all good because as a strategist, as a consultant and a coach, I work with so many podcasters to find something that is sustainable to help them grow and that feels exciting versus just following whatever framework someone suggested. So go and visit thepodcastspace.com/grow. And if it feels easier to reach out to me on Instagram, DM me. I'm at the podcast space. So I'll see you there. In the meantime, keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.